What's up, everybody? Here, back on the channel. Before we get into this one, I want to be straight with you about something. This is one of the most consequential military strikes in decades, so I did not want to just throw a video together off headlines. I went back through the Pentagon briefings, the IAEA reports, satellite imagery analysis from independent nuclear watchdogs, and the reporting from outlets that actually had people in the room at the press conferences. Everything I'm about to walk you through is sourced, and anywhere the picture is still fuzzy, anywhere it's genuinely unconfirmed, I'm going to tell you that flat out. No guessing dressed up as fact. No spinning a headline into something it isn't. That's the deal on this channel, and it's especially the deal on something this serious. Because people lost their lives in the broader conflict this strike was a part of, and there are still active questions about where a stockpile of near-weapons-grade uranium physically sits right now. So let's get into it. Let's get into it carefully. In the early hours of June 22, 2025, Iran time, the United States carried out a mission codenamed Operation Midnight Hammer. It was the U.S. military's first and so far only direct defensive action in what's now being called the 12-Day War, the conflict that started on June 13, 2025, when Israel launched a surprise campaign, Operation Rising Lion, against Iran's nuclear and military infrastructure. The American piece of it was a single, tightly coordinated strike package that hit 3 sites central to Iran's nuclear program: the Fordo Fuel Enrichment Plant, the Natanz Nuclear Facility, and the Isfahan Nuclear Technology Center. 7 B-2 Spirit stealth bombers dropped 14 GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators, the bunker busters in the title of this video, on Fordo and Natanz. A U.S. Navy submarine fired more than 24 Tomahawk cruise missiles at surface targets at Isfahan. In total, the Pentagon says roughly 125 aircraft were involved in supporting the operation, and about 75 precision-guided weapons were employed. President Trump's language that night was about as blunt as it gets. He said Iran's key nuclear enrichment facilities had been completely and totally obliterated. Well, that's a presidential claim, not a battle damage assessment, and I want you to hold on to that distinction because it matters a lot for how the rest of this story unfolded over the following year. We'll come back to it. Let's walk through the mission itself first, because from a pure aviation and operation standpoint, this is one of the more remarkable things the U.S. Air Force has pulled off in the last 25 years. 7 B-2 Spirit bombers took off from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri. Whiteman is the only place in the world these aircraft are based. From there, the strike package flew east across the Atlantic, across the Mediterranean, and into Iranian airspace. A continuous flight of around 18 hours to the target, refueled multiple times in the air along the way. According to Joint Chiefs Chairman General Dan Kane, this was the longest B-2 combat mission since the initial strikes in Afghanistan back in 2001. Now, here's a detail I think is genuinely underappreciated. While the real strike package was heading east, a separate group of B-2s flew west out over the Pacific as a deception element. Reporting had already surfaced that a group of bombers was headed toward Guam, and that reporting wasn't wrong. It just wasn't the whole picture. That's a classic deception operation, feeding the real story into the news cycle while the actual strike package does something completely different on the other side of the planet. If you've spent any time studying how these long-range packages are planned, that kind of layered deception is exactly what you'd want to see for a mission this sensitive, because leak discipline on something like this is almost impossible to guarantee. So you plan around the leak instead of just hoping it doesn't happen. Once the B-2s were in the Middle East, they linked up with 4th and 5th generation fighter aircraft, reportedly F-35s and F-22s, according to the president, that entered Iranian airspace ahead of the bombers. Their job was to sweep for Iranian fighters and to see whether Iran's surface-to-air missile systems would light up and engage. According to General Kane, no Iranian aircraft got airborne, and no SAM systems appear to have detected the package at all. Iran's air defenses had already taken a serious beating from 10 days of Israeli strikes by that point, and this mission leaned directly into that. This wasn't the U.S. going in against an intact, alert, integrated air defense system. It was going in after Israel had already spent 10 days rolling that system back. At approximately 6:40 p.m. Eastern Time, 2:10 Thomas 10 a.m. in Iran, the lead B-2 released the first 2 GBU-57 bombs on Fordo. Over the next 25 minutes, the rest of the package dropped the remaining bombs, 12 total on Fordo, 2 on an underground portion of Natanz. Just before the bombers crossed into Iranian airspace, a U.S. submarine, widely believed to be one of the Navy's 4 Ohio-class guided missile submarines, the only vessels in the fleet capable of launching that volume of Tomahawks in a single salvo, fired more than 24 missiles at Isfahan. According to Kane, the strike package exited Iranian airspace without a single shot fired at it on the way in or the way out. That's an extraordinary outcome for a mission flying 7 of America's most expensive and most strategically important aircraft directly over hostile, if degraded, territory. And I want to be honest with you, that part of the mission, purely as a flight ops and mission planning achievement, is about as close to textbook as it gets. Whether the political and strategic outcome matches, that execution is a separate question, and it's the one everybody's still arguing about. Let's actually talk about the weapon in the title, because I think most people watching news coverage of this have heard the term bunker buster 100 times without really knowing what it means. The GBU-57 is officially called the Massive Ordnance Penetrator, or MOP. It is a 30,000-pound bomb, about 20 feet long, and it is right now the largest non-nuclear weapon in the U.S. arsenal. It's not a bomb that blows things up on impact the way you're picturing a normal bomb doing. It's designed to physically punch through layers of rock and reinforced concrete using its own mass and velocity, then detonate once it's deep underground, so the explosive force gets trapped and concentrated against the structure it's targeting rather than venting harmlessly into open air. Here's the thing that made this mission unique in the weapon's entire history. This was the first time the GBU-57 has ever been used in actual combat. It's existed for years. It's been tested extensively, but June 21st, 2025 was the first time it had ever been dropped on a real target in a real war. The Pentagon has openly said the weapon's 15-year development arc was driven specifically by the need to hold Fordo at risk, meaning this bomb was, in a very real sense, built for this exact mission years before anyone knew when or if it would actually be used. The GBU-57 can only be carried and dropped by the B-2 Spirit. No other aircraft in the U.S. has inventory, and no other country's aircraft can currently deliver this weapon. That's part of why the B-2s had to make an 18-hour multiple refueling flight instead of launching from somewhere closer. There simply wasn't another platform capable of carrying this specific bomb. There's also a piece of Tomahawk history worth mentioning here, because that missile did real work on this mission too, and it doesn't get much airtime next to the bigger, flashier bomb. The Tomahawk land attack missile is a subsonic cruise missile that's been in U.S. service since the 1980s. Launched from surface ships or submarines flying low and using terrain-referenced and satellite guidance to hit a fixed target from hundreds of miles away. It doesn't have anywhere near the penetrating power of a GBU-57. It's built for precision against surface infrastructure, not for punching through a mountain, which is exactly why it was the tool of choice for Isfahan's above-ground buildings rather than Fordo's buried enrichment halls. More than 24 of them fired from a single submerged submarine is still a serious volume of fire, and it's a good reminder that a mission like this isn't really about one big scary bomb. It's a layered strike package where every weapon is matched to a specific kind of target. Now let's talk about what it was actually up against, because the target itself is arguably the more interesting engineering story here. Fordo is the site everyone was watching most closely, and for good reason. It's buried somewhere between 80 and 90 meters, roughly 260 to 300 feet underground, inside a mountain near the city of Qom, about 160 kilometers south of Tehran. It wasn't originally built as a nuclear facility at all. It started as an IRGC missile base before being converted into an enrichment site. It was discovered by Western intelligence and publicly revealed back in 2009. For years, there was a genuine unresolved debate inside the defense and nuclear policy world about whether any conventional weapon, even the GBU-57, could actually reach deep enough into Fordo to meaningfully damage the enrichment halls. That debate is a big part of why this weapon took 15 years to develop into its current form. It's also why the mission used 12 of the 14 total bombs on this one site. General Keane said the lead bomber dropped the first 2 bombs, and additional bombers hit follow-up aim points, essentially stacking penetrations to maximize the odds of actually reaching the buried structure. There's also a detail from the pre-strike period that I think is worth flagging, because it shows this wasn't a surprise nobody saw coming on the Iranian side. In the days before the June 21st strike, satellite imagery showed Iran attempting to backfill and seal the ventilation shafts at Fordo with concrete, apparently trying to deny both a potential bunker buster strike and any theoretical commando raid through those shafts. General Keane confirmed at the Pentagon briefing that U.S. planners knew about this, and it accounted for the dimensions of those concrete caps in their targeting. So this wasn't planners guessing at an unknown structure. By the time of the strike, both sides had been maneuvering around each other's expected moves for days. And it's also worth knowing that this specific strike wasn't dreamed up in the days before it happened. Fordo's origins trace back to Iran's early 2000s, Ahmad Plan under the internal code name Al-Ghadir, when it was reportedly conceived as a secret facility for producing weapon-grade uranium using lower enriched feedstock from the much larger Natanz site. After the Ahmad plan was officially shut down in 2003, construction at Fordo reportedly continued anyway, and the site stayed hidden from the outside world for years until Western intelligence agencies uncovered it, and Western leaders went public with its existence in 2009. Iran's own response at the time was to declare it a civilian facility for low-enriched uranium production and to allow international inspections. But inspectors who visited soon after reported that the facility's internal piping, equipment, and feed stations looked consistent with a site built for weapons-grade production, not the peaceful characterization Iran was offering. And there's also reporting that the US and Israel had rehearsed something very close to this exact mission well before it happened. ABC News reported that the two militaries ran a practice exercise for this kind of strike back in mid-2024 during the previous administration, and a separate joint US-Israeli air exercise in March 2025 was described by Israeli media at the time as a deliberate warning signal to Tehran. So whatever your read on the decision to actually pull the trigger in June 2025, the operational planning behind it wasn't improvised. It had been sitting on the shelf, tested and ready for a while. That said, the decision itself was reportedly contested at the highest levels right up until it happened. Multiple advisors close to the administration, including Steve Bannon and Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard, had publicly warned against going to war with Iran, with the intelligence community's own assessment at the time reportedly not concluding that Iran was actively building a weapon. That assessment shifted in the following weeks, and it's a useful reminder that even inside the US government, this wasn't a unanimous clean call. It was a genuinely contested decision about how to interpret ambiguous intelligence on a very high-stakes target. Natanz is Iran's other main enrichment site, located in Isfahan province. It houses two separate enrichment complexes, the pilot fuel enrichment plant and the larger fuel enrichment plant. Natanz had already been hit by Israel on June 13th at the very start of the conflict when Israeli strikes destroyed the above-ground portion of the pilot fuel enrichment plant and caused a documented radiological release confined to the facility itself, meaning contamination from uranium hexafluoride gas and alpha particles inside the plant, not a release affecting the surrounding public. On June 21st, the U.S. added two more MOABs on an underground portion of Natanz, and satellite imagery afterwards showed a crater roughly 5 meters in diameter directly over part of the underground complex. Isfahan is a different kind of target. It's a sprawling nuclear campus that includes a chemical laboratory, a uranium conversion facility, and reactor fuel manufacturing infrastructure. Rather than sending B-2s there, the U.S. relied entirely on the submarine-launched Tomahawks, more than 24 of them, against surface infrastructure. Two theories exist for why Isfahan didn't get the bunker buster treatment. Either its air defenses were considered more robust and risky for a B-2 approach, or the specific targets there simply didn't require deep earth penetration the way Fordo and Natanz did. Satellite imagery from Maxar Technologies taken the day after the strikes showed extensive new building damage across the Isfahan site. Here's where I have to slow down, because this is the single most contested part of the entire story, and it's exactly the kind of place where a lot of channels just repeat whichever version of the headline fits the narrative they want. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to walk you through what different credible sources have actually said because they don't all agree. And pretending they do isn't honest analysis, it's just picking a side and calling it reporting. At the initial Pentagon briefing, General Keane said in his own words that initial battle damage assessments indicate that all three sites sustained extremely severe damage and destruction, while also being careful to note that a final battle damage assessment would take time. That's an important nuance. Even the Pentagon's own messaging at the time distinguished between an initial assessment and a final one. In the days and weeks that followed, independent nuclear monitoring organizations weighed in with their own imagery analysis. The Institute for Science and International Security, a well-regarded independent nuclear policy think tank that's been tracking Iran's program for decades, published a detailed assessment concluding that the strikes had, in their words, effectively destroyed Iran's centrifuge enrichment program, and that it would be a long time before Iran approached its pre-strike capability. At the same time, their reporting was careful to flag what wasn't fully resolved, the fate of Iran's stockpiles of enriched uranium, including a very concerning figure, roughly 400 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% sitting just below weapons-grade territory. The IAEA had verified that stockpile just days before the conflict began and then lost the ability to verify it once the fighting started. The IAEA's own Director General, Rafael Grossi, gave a more cautious public assessment than the White House did. He said it was clear that Fordo had been directly impacted, but that the degree of damage inside the actual uranium enrichment halls could not be determined with certainty from outside monitoring. That's coming from the head of the international body specifically tasked with verifying nuclear facilities, and even he was stopping short of obliterated. And separately, both the CIA and the Israel Atomic Energy Commission reportedly assessed that Fordo had been rendered functionally inoperable, and that the combined strikes had set the program back by years. But even that language, set back, is a different claim than total destruction. So where does that leave us? I think the honest, unspun version is this. The physical enrichment infrastructure at all three sites took catastrophic damage. Independent satellite analysis backs that up consistently from multiple organizations, not just U.S. government sources. But the enrichment program is destroyed, and the enriched uranium stockpile is gone, are two completely different claims. And only the first one has strong, consistent, independent verification. The second one, where that roughly 400 kilograms of near-weapons-grade material actually is right now, remained genuinely unresolved for a long time after the strike, and Iran has not allowed the IAEA the access it needs to verify it. This is where I think this video earns its latest in the title, because a lot of the coverage out there still treats Operation Midnight Hammer like it was the final chapter. It wasn't. Iran's parliament responded to the strikes by passing legislation suspending the country's cooperation with the IAEA, which meant inspectors lost on-the-ground access to these sites almost entirely going forward. Iran's Atomic Energy Organization publicly called the American strikes a barbaric act that violated the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and said it intended to pursue the matter in international courts while continuing its nuclear program in some form. Iran's government has also stated that radiation monitoring around the 3 sites showed no signs of contamination reaching nearby residents, a claim that hasn't been independently contradicted in the reporting I reviewed. For whatever that's worth on a topic this politically charged, then, in early 2026, things escalated again. On March 1st and 2nd of 2026, Natanz was struck a second time, this round attributed to Israel rather than the United States, hitting entrance buildings and access points at the site rather than the core underground enrichment plant itself. The IAEA confirmed damage to those entrance structures and stated there was no additional radiological risk detected. A further strike followed on March 21st. Independent imagery analysis around the same period also identified damage at other related sites, a covert facility referred to as Minza Day High, and structures at the Lavasan-2 Mojdeh complex tied to Iran's nuclear weapons administrative infrastructure. As part of what looks like an ongoing Israeli campaign to keep dismantling reconstituted pieces of the program separate from the original June 2025 mission, that escalation continued until a ceasefire was reached in early April 2026. Since then, independent satellite monitoring, again from the Institute for Science and International Security, using continuously updated commercial satellite imagery, paints a picture of a program that is heavily damaged but not abandoned. As of their most recent comprehensive imagery reports from spring 2026, here's roughly where things stand. There is no evidence of any renewed uranium enrichment activity, and the centrifuge program remains destroyed. At the same time, Iran has been observed conducting damage assessments, limited cleanup, and reinforcement work at several sites, including building protective barriers at tunnel entrances at Isfahan, specifically designed to block a straight-line missile approach, something analysts have described as cruise missile chicane barriers. At Fordo, imagery from into 2026 shows the site largely dormant, with tunnel entrances still backfilled and no clear evidence of renewed access to the underground enrichment halls themselves. And at Natanz, there's been minimal visible repair, though Iran has apparently constructed roofing over some damaged buildings, which independent analysts read as an attempt to block the overhead satellite monitoring that's now the primary way anyone outside Iran can track what's happening there at all, since on-the-ground inspections effectively stopped. And that 400-plus kilogram stockpile of 60% enriched uranium I mentioned earlier, as of the most recent IAEA reporting I could find, its precise location still has not been independently verified. Iran has told the agency that continuing to implement standard safeguards inspections is, in its own words, untenable given the circumstances. There's also been continued monitoring of a site called Pickaxe Mountain near Natanz, which Western intelligence assesses could potentially be developed into a new, deeper enrichment facility. Construction there has reportedly continued since the original strikes, and it's specifically flagged in recent defense analysis as a site that would likely require its own future bunker buster mission if the international community decides it needs to be neutralized. So, the honest state of play, as of the most current reporting available, Iran's declared enrichment infrastructure took the most severe blow it's ever taken from 2 separate rounds of American and Israeli strikes over the better part of a year. The centrifuge program specifically looks functionally dead for now, but the material that would actually be needed to build a weapon has not been confirmed destroyed, verified, or accounted for by the international inspectors whose entire job is to track exactly that. That's not a headline that fits neatly into either total victory or nothing was accomplished, and I think that's exactly why you don't see it summarized cleanly very often. It's genuinely a mixed, unresolved picture, and I'd rather give you that than something cleaner and wrong. I want to spend a minute on the B-2 itself because I think it's easy to get so focused on the bomb that you skip past just how much of this mission rode on one specific airframe. The B-2 Spirit has been in service since the 1990s, and there are only 20 of them in the entire Air Force inventory. This is genuinely one of the rarest, most expensive aircraft types operating anywhere in the world. It's a flying wing design, meaning it has no traditional fuselage or tail the way most aircraft do. The whole airframe is one continuous, low observable shape, which is a huge part of how it managed to fly directly into and out of Iranian airspace without apparently being detected by air defense radar. Every B-2 mission of any real distance requires multiple aerial refuelings, which is exactly what happened here. The strike package refueled several times over the Atlantic and Mediterranean during the roughly 18-hour transit to the target. Flying 7 of these aircraft on a single mission with a full decoy package operating simultaneously in the opposite direction over an 18-hour plus round trip into contested airspace, time to link up precisely with fighter escort, and a submarine-launched missile strike happening on a completely different axis. That's about as complex a joint air and sea operation as you'll see outside of a full-scale war. Whatever you think about the strategic wisdom of the strike itself, the actual execution of getting those aircraft in, dropping ordnance on multiple aim points across 2 sites in about 25 minutes, and getting every aircraft home without taking fire is a genuinely difficult thing to pull off, and it's worth understanding just how much had to go right for that outcome. And it's worth remembering these jets were doing all of this while carrying a payload that pushed right up against their limits. 2 GBU-57s per aircraft at 30,000 pounds each is a serious load for a low observable airframe to haul across an ocean and a continent while still maintaining the radar cross-section discipline that makes the B-2 survivable in contested airspace in the first place. Every refueling, every course correction, every minute spent inside range of Iranian air defenses added risk to 7 of the roughly 20 B-2s the Air Force actually has in its entire fleet, meaning this single mission put a meaningful percentage of America's entire stealth bomber force in harm's way at once. That's not a decision any planner makes lightly, and it's part of why the deception package flying the opposite direction toward Guam mattered as much as it did. Look, I want to be careful here because I'm giving you an operational and technical read, not a foreign policy verdict. That's a much bigger conversation involving people who study this for a living in a very different way than I do. From a pure execution standpoint, Operation Midnight Hammer was about as clean a long-range precision strike as you're going to see. Getting 7 B-2s in and out of hostile airspace with a synchronized submarine launch and 0 shots fired at the package on a mission that had been an engineering development for 15 years specifically to make this exact target possible is a legitimately remarkable achievement. And I don't think that gets said enough in the noisier parts of this conversation. But I think the obliterated framing oversold the certainty of the outcome, and I think the last year of reporting backs that up. The physical enrichment infrastructure took brutal, probably program-ending damage in its current form. That part is about as well supported as anything in the story. What isn't well supported, even now, is any confident claim about where Iran's existing enriched uranium stockpile physically sits or what Iran has quietly been doing at sites like Pickaxe Mountain since the ceasefire, until the IAEA gets relaxers back, or until there's a lot more open source imagery specifically pointing at that stockpile. I think the most honest thing anyone can say is that this significantly damaged the program without providing full certainty that the most dangerous material is accounted for. That's not the flashy conclusion, but it's the one the actual sourcing supports, and that's the only kind of conclusion I want to hand you on a topic like this. I also think it's worth sitting with just how unusual this mission is in the broader sweep of U.S. military history. This was the first American strike on Iranian soil since a naval engagement back in 1988, and the first direct U.S. action against an Iranian target since the killing of Qasem Soleimani in 2020. Presidents have weighed and shelved plans to hit Fordow for close to 15 years, going back through multiple administrations, precisely because the risk calculus was so difficult. The facility was too deep for existing weapons. The regional escalation risk was enormous, and nobody wanted to own the outcome if a strike failed to actually reach the target. The fact that it finally happened, and happened as part of a coordinated campaign that started with an Israeli air campaign and ended with a very specific American contribution aimed only at the nuclear infrastructure, tells you a lot about how much the regional picture had shifted by mid-2025 with Iran's proxy network and air defenses already degraded well before the B-2s ever crossed into its airspace. I'd also gently push back on anyone telling you the story is simple in either direction. If someone tells you Iran's nuclear ambitions are permanently finished, that's not what the IAEA, the Institute for Science and International Security, or the Arms Control Association are actually saying in their own published assessments. Every one of them leaves the stockpile question open. And if someone tells you the strike accomplished nothing, that's not supported either. Independent non-government satellite analysis consistently shows catastrophic damage to the actual enrichment infrastructure at all 3 sites, repeated and confirmed across more than a year of follow-up imagery. The truth, as usual with something this complicated, sits in the uncomfortable middle, and I'd rather leave you there accurately than move you somewhere cleaner and wrong. So that's Operation Midnight Hammer, from the mechanics of the mission itself through to where things actually stand right now, more than a year out, not just the night of the headlines. The GBU-57 did its job in combat for the first time ever. The B-2 crews executed an extraordinarily difficult mission close to flawlessly. And the actual strategic outcome, how much this really set Iran's nuclear ambitions back, is still, honestly, an open question that the people whose job it is to answer it haven't fully closed out yet. I'll keep tracking this one as more imagery and AEA reporting comes out, because this is clearly not over. If this kind of grounded sourced military breakdown is what you come to this channel for, do me a favor and hit subscribe with notifications on WADA. I go through stuff like this the same way every time. Primary sources first, speculation clearly labeled as speculation, no rage bait headlines. That's the only way I know how to do it, and it's the only way I want this channel to grow. And before you go, drop a comment below telling me what you want broken down next, whether that's another angle on this operation, a look at the B-2's history, or a different current event entirely. I read every comment, and a lot of what ends up on this channel starts right there in that comment section. Thanks for watching.